So today I'm going to show you how to paint a cow ear and eye in acrylics. I'm using a number 10 round brush, and I'm going to start by filling in some of the shadows. So I'm using some raw umber, alizarin crimson, a little bit of black, and some dioxazine purple. And I'm just paying attention to my reference photo and filling in wherever the deepest, darkest shadows would be. There's not a lot of water in the brush, but as the paint runs out, you start seeing it's a little bit more transparent. And so I will end up going back through and adding more layers to that. Continually paying attention to my reference photo and just filling in anywhere I see that are the shadow areas. I want to avoid the highlight area because I will be adding a different color to that mix to create more of a transparent color where it looks like the sun is shining through the ear, and it makes the ear look a little bit more transparent. And I will show you how I do that in just a few minutes. And I highly suggest printing out a photo like I have here just on regular printer paper in color and putting it next to whatever area of the painting you're working on. If you're able to do that, it really helps you see where things may be off or what needs adjusting. Now I'm just adding some dioxazine purple or red oxide to that and magenta. And this is where I'm starting to fill in a little bit more of the highlight areas. And it gives it more of a reddish glow. I will end up glazing over this. Just adjusting the colors as I go, paying attention to my reference photo, working my way around the ear. Now I've noticed that after it has dried a little bit, it's not quite as opaque as I want, so I'm going to do another layer of the shadow areas. Defining the outline of the ear a little bit more as I go. And in the highlight areas, I want to keep those really warm, so I'm adding some alizarin crimson to that highlight area so that I can define the highlight and the shadow area a little bit more. In this part of the painting, I just want to make sure the area I'm working on is covered in paint, and then I can start adding more layers to that. I mixed a little bit of raw umber and dioxazine purple to that, and I'm adding another coat to the layers, or to the shadow areas, adding more layers to the shadows. To add another color, I'm adding some burnt sienna right underneath the ear area by the eye. I noticed that it's a little bit more of a golden color. So I'm adding a little bit of that to the mixture. Now I want to make sure this is completely dry before I go through and do any glazes on top of that. Otherwise it will lift off the paint underneath. So I'm using the number 10 round, and I'm adding some magenta to that and some alizarin crimson. And I'm going to add that in the highlight areas to bring a little bit more warmth to that. That's how you give the illusion that the ear is thin in that area and more transparent. I'm adding that primarily just to where I see the highlight area in the ear. I do have quite a bit of water onto my brush, so you could see that I was using my finger to spread that paint out a little bit. And some of the darker areas I noticed were a little bit too much of a brown color, so I did add some purple to that and glazing over some purple, and I'm starting to draw in some of the hair textures that I see. All it is just paying attention to your reference photos and keeping an eye on the colors that you see. We have our values established, so now it's all about the colors. This is more of an opaque color that I'm putting on, and this is so that I can glaze over the top of that in the future layer. I do end up taking some brighter color to that and adding another layer before I end up glazing. And all it is really just adding layers upon layers and adjusting as you go. So now I'm going to start to add in some of the hair textures that I see. I'm mixing up a nice, rich, deep gray color. And when you're painting hair, you want to think of it as a clump of hair and not the individual hairs. Especially in this stage, you want to think of it as a clump and not individual. Otherwise, it will look a little too detailed for this stage in the painting. So this is the part where I'm adding some of the portrait pink and some titanium white so that I can glaze over the top of that. There are some areas in the ear which are really transparent looking, and in order to get that, the best way to do that is with a glaze. And all a glaze is mixing either your paint with a medium or mixing it with some water to really thin down that pigment. You want to let that dry completely before you add your next glazing layer over the top of that, or it will lift the paint off of it. So now I'm mixing up the area for the glaze for the transparent areas in the ear. And I'm using a mixture of some raw sienna and a little bit of magenta and alizarin crimson, and then I tone that down a little bit with the raw umber, and I keep testing it against my reference photo to make sure I'm getting the shade correct. There is quite a bit of water on my brush, and I'm just able to go over all those areas that I put down that really light color and glaze that color over. And I'm paying attention to the color shifts that I see in the reference photo. So I'm not doing a glaze of just one solid color all the way throughout. I kind of jump around and scumble around, and that gives it a little bit more of a realistic feel and adds more dimension. Those subtle color shifts are really what make the painting. And here I'm looking at my what I've already previously filled in and painted, and I want to make sure that there's a lot of harmony in the painting and that my colors aren't completely off of what I was using in the previous video that you saw. I want to make sure that they are all going to complement each other. So here I'm starting to mix up some lighter gray color, and this is for the hair that I see around the ear, the long hairs inside the ear. And I'm using an angle brush for this. A nice cool gray is what I see, and I'm just matching that to my reference photo, checking my value on that. And then I just use the sharp point and draw in any areas that I see have that highlight color on it. I'm not looking to draw in every single hair. I just want to add the suggestion of hair at this point. Once I get to the final stage on the ear is when I take out my liner brush and start adding in my final touches and the individual hairs. But at this point, I'm just looking to place in my shadows and my highlights. And if your highlights do get a little bright, it's not to worry. You can always glaze over and add a little bit more dimension doing that as well. There are some smaller hairs here on the outer ear, so I wanted to do shorter strokes to create smaller hairs. I'm going with the direction of the hair growth when I paint these in. That's very important because that establishes the structure of the ear. I will end up glazing over this. And I did a lighter color on purpose so that I could glaze over it. So I'm going to do the same thing, adding in some of the deeper colors that I see in the long hairs. And you just continue this process until you get it completely laid out when you're happy with it. So while that is drying inside the ear, I'm going to work on the outer ear. And I'm just mixing up some of the lighter color of the yellows that I see. It's very similar to the background, the sky color that we used. It does have a little bit more of a golden tinge to it. Here I'm adding in a little bit of highlight to the hair on the outer ear. That gives it its glowing effect. And now I'm taking a rake brush and I've dipped that in some water, and I'm mixing a darker color for the small amount of hair that you see on the outer ear. That just helps give me a hair-like texture without having to draw in or paint in each individual hair. When you're painting an animal and using the rake brush for the fur, I don't suggest using it for the entire fur texture. You could use it as base layers, as I do later in the video, in the next video. But adding in a different brush will add a different texture to the painting as well. Just continue adding in all these dark hairs that you see. And I'm making them a little bit more prominent in my painting at this stage, because I am going to go through and add a little bit more highlight and adjust those a little bit later. And with the rake brush, one thing you want to make sure of is you do have, in order to get that texture, you want to make sure you add a lot of water to it, as if you were using a liner brush. If you don't, it won't give you the hair-like strokes. Now I'm going back to my angle brush, and I'm going to start glazing in more on the inner ear while the outer ear dries. Anywhere that I see that color that I mixed up in my reference photo, I go ahead and add it to my painting. And then I move on to the next color. Continually checking and making sure that there's still harmony within the painting and that I have the correct tones that I used previously in the painting. So I did notice that in my painting that I have there, it's not quite as purple toned as my reference photo, so I went ahead and mixed up a nice purple glaze again and started toning some of that back in. This is just a process of going back and forth until you get the results that you want. And all of those layers that you're doing aren't wasted layers. If you're going to paint over them, those layers still tend to shine through a little bit. And that just gives the painting more depth and dimension and more detail. Now here I've mixed up a nice red color that I am glazing once again over some of the transparent areas in the ear where the ear is really thin. If you're painting, I suggest that periodically you step away from your painting and take a look at your reference photo and your painting from a distance. Usually 6 to 8 feet kind of helps give you an idea if your values are correct. Sometimes when you have been painting and sitting for so long, staring up close at a painting, it's hard to see where things may be off. So stepping away, taking a 10-minute break, constantly glancing at your painting helps you realize where maybe adjustments need to be made. So I decided that the transparent areas and some of the hair in the ear wasn't quite as visible enough. So I'm doing another layer of some opaque color so that I can glaze on top of that. And for this I have the rake brush again. So now I'm using a flat brush and I'm mixing up a nice golden color to glaze over the outer ear. Now I'm adding a really bright color to help with that glow effect. This color is very similar to the color that we used for the sun area in the painting. Now I'm taking my angle brush and mixing a nice rich color again, and doing another glaze and adjusting my values and my tones for the inside of the ear. Just continue that process until you get the tone that you want. Paying attention to your reference photo, looking at all the color shifts that happen. Now I'm on to the detail portion, and I'm taking a liner brush. I want to make sure there's quite a bit of water mixed in with that. And I'm mixing up a highlight color for the hair inside the ear. And I'm just going to look at my reference photo and pick out where I think I see individual hairs. I'm not doing straight lines, I'm kind of doing a squiggly motion And that just gives it a nice realistic hair texture. I'm just continuing to build up the detail, adding those little details that help make it appear more realistic. I'm varying my colors again just to give it more of a tonal range. Now I'm mixing up some of my shadow color to add a little bit more shadow into the hair. And I'm noticing that some smaller hairs are peeking through the inner ear into the outer ear. So I wanted to continue that hair into the inside of the ear. So I'm just gonna pull some of that color in, add a little bit more detail to the outer ear. Just really trying to add more realism to the ear. Now I'm mixing up a lighter color, and I'm going to go back through the same technique that I used for the shadow areas, and I'm going to adjust some of the hairs that I see may have gotten a little bit too heavy or thick in some areas. And this is pretty much just the background color that we have for our sky. I'm just going ahead and readjusting and realigning some of the hairs. And I do feather that through the sky so that if it is not an exact color match, it won't be noticeable. Just continue this process until you're happy with the outline of the hair. Compare it to your reference photo always. Now I'm going back to the flat brush, and I want to make sure that that sky color is going to blend with what I had just filled in. And I also noticed that the hair was a little bit too thick in that area and too dominant. So I went through with some of the sky color with the flat brush and just did a little heavier coat on that. This is where stepping away from the painting really helps to determine where something might look off. Stepping away really lets you see some of the brightest highlights and the deepest shadows. Sometimes when you're up close, it's harder to see your values. So here I'm checking the highlight area, and I want to make sure that there's harmony with the highlight area on the body and the highlight on the ear. So I'm taking some of the highlight area or the highlight color that I had mixed for the ear and applying that and brightening up some of the highlights that I see in the body. This is the best way to get harmony in a painting if you're not doing the entire painting all at once, and if you're doing sections like I am. This is the best way that you can get that harmony, is by each time you sit down to paint, incorporating a little bit of that color into what you've already painted, just to make sure those colors do match. I really wanted to give that sunlit effect, so I am brightening some of those highlight areas in the body. I did notice that the legs needed a little bit more adjusting, so I'm using some of the colors that I had mixed for the ear and incorporating some of that. It's just a process of building up those details. Sometimes when you sit down to paint and you're looking at your reference photo, very often those smaller details get overlooked. And so the next time that you sit down to paint, you may notice more detail that you either forgot or that you want to adjust. Now I'm just adding some detail to the shadowed areas. Even though your painting may have strong shadows in it, there is going to be some detail in there. Your values are just going to be much darker in those areas. So if you're going for realism, it's important not to forget about those areas. So now I'm taking a small round brush and I'm going to start working on the eye. So I'm creating a nice deep color, and I like to look at my eye and on my reference photo and start just painting in where the really dark areas are. That really helps outline what I need to work on and starts my values. Pay attention to those small color shifts that you see, especially in eyes. If you want to make them look realistic, it's not going to be just a dark color and a highlight color. So I'm mixing some blue in there because I do see some blue. So I'm varying those colors and paying attention to those minute color shifts that you see. And that's what really gives you that realism. I do notice that there is a highlight on the eye, and it's in the shape of a triangle, so I'm going ahead and adding in a light gray purple to that. Testing my colors on my reference photo and my values. Working on a small area like this is where your sketch comes in really handy. If you're new to painting and you haven't quite mastered drawing, I highly suggest, if you just want to jump into painting, to go ahead and either trace the image or project it, and then you can start working on your painting. But if your image is skewed to begin with, it's going to be really difficult to follow all your shadow areas and your highlight areas in your painting. So having a detailed sketch and a correctly portioned sketch in the beginning will really help down the road when you're starting to pick out areas in your painting to detail. And I'm just continuing to work on my values, and I'm stepping away a little bit, looking at it from afar and seeing how close I am to my reference photo and adjusting from there. And then because it is a watercolor canvas, the paint doesn't come off quite as opaque. It does tend to come off a little bit more translucent, and I am using Liquitex Basics, which claims it's an opaque paint, but I find that it's pretty translucent, and I tend to like that because I do a lot of glazing, but it does require more layers then. Now I'm going to start working my way out, start adding in some pinkish tones around the eye. And that's for the color of the skin underneath the hair that you see. So I'm just laying in our base before we start adding in our hair. And with most animals, around their eye is going to be a little bit more on the pink side because the skin around that area is so thin, and the hair around that area usually isn't quite as thick and prominent either. We're using the same process that we used for the rest of the painting, and that is just blocking in all of those shadows and those highlight areas and paying attention to those small color shifts that you see. When I'm blocking in a painting, I am not blocking it in with just one solid color. I'm blocking it in with all of the colors that I see. So you'll see me frequently switch colors as I'm blocking in, and that for me just helps keep me on track and keeps the painting flowing so that when I do look back at my reference photo, I know a reference point and where to start at because I already have that color blocked in. So I had let the eye dry and I noticed that it did need a darker value in there. So I went in with another layer of the darker color and added that in where I thought it needed it. Now I'm filling in the portion of the eye where the tear duct would be. On cows and even with dogs, that's kind of where their gland is. That kind of builds up with some gunk, so that's what I'm painting in now. And I'm color matching for the top of the eye onto my reference photo. I want to make sure that color is very similar. And I'm not looking for a lot of detail at this point. I am doing hair-like strokes, but I'm not looking for really defined detail. I'm more so just looking for values. Here I am going back to a darker color. I realized that the shape of the eyelid was off, so I'm adding in a darker color into the ear to reshape that eye because it is behind it. As the paint has run off my brush, I'm adding a little bit into the crease that you see above the eye. Filling in all of the shadow areas that I see with this darker color. As I fill this in, I'm paying attention to the hair growth. So whichever way the hair is growing is where you're gonna want to put your stroke. It's very important that even during your base layers, you're following that hair growth pattern to give it a realistic effect. So I decided it would probably be best to zoom in this area, and you won't be able to see the colors that I'm mixing, but I thought it was more important for you to see what I am painting up close and my how I'm holding the brush and these strokes that I'm using. I'm still using the small round brush, and the hairs around the eye are so tiny that I'm just doing almost just little dots. And as it works out from away from the eye, the hair does get a little bit longer. I have most of my shadows in around the eye, so I'm just starting to build up my highlights. I'm not starting out with a really bright highlight. I'm working my way up to add depth in the hair. Now, for these really fine hairs, I am going to take a liner brush, and I wanted to go ahead and start painting in some of the eyelashes that I see as well. So I'm just following what I see, making sure I have a lot of water on my brush to help it flow and keep that line really thin and transparent. And I am holding my brush up close and not very loosely. It's more of a structured hold because I don't want to be too free with these. I want these hairs and these eyelashes to fall where they would normally fall, so it gives me a little bit more control. The farther you hold on the handle, the less control you're going to have of the tip of your brush. So just continue putting in these hairs, following your reference photo wherever you see them. Using a really light pressure to get nice thin lines. The harder you push on the brush, the thicker the stroke is going to be. And for eyelash areas and thin hairs like this, really distinct hairs, I want them to be really thin. And I've used a little bit brighter color for this right here. That way I can add more dimension to those eyelashes. Some of them are hitting the sun a little bit more than others, and that's what gives it that illusion, is by alternating your values and your colors. So even on those whisker hairs or eyelashes, you're still going to have highlights and shadows. They're not going to be just white. Now I'm just completing the painting using the liner brush, adding a little bit more detail around the eye to the hair texture, and that will complete the ear and the eye. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment box below, and I will put a link to my Facebook page and my Instagram page. Go ahead and follow me there, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and please like and subscribe. Thank you.